One other thing that you'll see next week, Caitlin, is Trump actually reenacting the Madison Square Garden rally in 1939. I write about this in my book. President Franklin Roosevelt was appalled that neo-Nazis, fascists in America were lining up to essentially pledge their support for the kind of government that they were seeing in Germany.
Welcome to the Open Minds Show. I'm your host, Christopher Balquin. And folks, what I'm trying to do is inject more moderate voices into our politics today, because let's face it, it's getting harder and harder to navigate without being labeled a racist or a misogynist or any other label you can think of that is so extreme. And in my opinion, it's the moderate voice that gets lost. And I would argue so many of us are actually moderates. And I thought about covering what Tony Hinchcliffe said at the Trump rally at Madison Square Garden, because I think this is actually emblematic of everything that I think can be changed in our politics today. But before I do, I want to begin by highlighting how Hillary Clinton had characterized Trump supporters, Republicans, conservatives supporting Trump at the MSG rally. She linked Trump's upcoming rally to a 1939 Nazi gathering at Madison Square Garden, a rally held by American fascists that openly supported the Nazi regime. Clinton said that Trump's rally would be a reenactment of that infamous event, connecting supporters of Trump to a much more darker time in American history, which gathered those that supported fascism. Now, I want us to pause here and think about what this comparison implies. It labels all Trump supporters as this Nazi supporter, a Nazi rally. It's not just a critique. It frames the entire event as anti-American, extremist, threatening the core values, saying Trump is a threat to democracy. And this reinforces that idea that conservatism today aligns with dangerous and intolerant views and ideas that I think many Democrats have been characterizing Republicans of for many years. Many of us remember many comparisons. Even George W. Bush was made to Adolf Hitler in the early 2000s. Now, Hillary Clinton's comparison aside, it's a long-standing narrative from the left that casts conservatism as morally corrupt, out of touch, and hostile to diversity. Now, I don't want to speak on behalf of all Democrats, but I would argue this same type of rhetoric is what I've heard from more liberal and left-leaning supporters. The idea that conservatives are morally corrupt, they're anti-immigrant, they're xenophobic, they're not inclusive. These are all characterizations that the left has made of conservatives. And what I also noticed was this connection of Trump with extremism is consistent, and it has been consistent over time. But here's where things get a little bit tricky. Now, before I play Tony Hinchcliffe's clips of his stand-up routine, and I want to make sure that I get this right. These were jokes that Tony Hinchcliffe said. But before I do, I just want to say that rhetoric that Hillary Clinton has provided, I think is exactly what more moderate conservatives are trying to get away from. The idea that conservatism is xenophobic or racist is being disproven every day when we see more and more members of underrepresented groups who are conservative align themselves, their politics in an open way with conservative values. Vivek Ramaswamy and others who have run for office is but one example. Tulsi Gabbard, another. But more and more prominent first and second generation immigrants are coming forward saying more and more conservative values are aligning with their own, perhaps because many more liberal values are becoming more alienating to first and second generation immigrants in particular. So as conservatism tries to dispel the myth that there's this xenophobia, this racism deeply embedded inside conservatism, We get what happened at the Trump rally. And so I'm going to play a clip for you of Tony Hinchcliffe's. Again, I want to reiterate, these are stand-up bits, jokes that Tony Hinchcliffe said at the Trump rally. Here we go.
Texas stuff is really, really crazy. We're right there by a wide open border. Where are my proud Latinos at tonight? You guys see what I mean? It's wide open. There's so many of them. It's absolutely incredible. Believe it or not, people, I welcome migrants to the United States of America with open arms. And by open arms, I mean like this. It's wild. And these Latinos, they love making babies too. Just know that. They do. They do. There's no pulling out. They don't do that. They come inside, just like they did to our country. Republicans are the party with a good sense of humor.
Now, if you're a fan of Tony Hinchcliffe and if you're a fan of his show, Kill Tony, you know Tony Hinchcliffe definitely does push the boundaries on what is and is not acceptable when it comes to comedy and humor. And I think that's part of the truth of comedy. It is to push the boundaries as much as possible. But in this vein, in this kind of time period in which conservatives and Republicans are trying to shed that skin of what conservatives have been characterized as or caricatured as, I feel like this was perhaps the most improper time for Tony Hinchcliffe to be making these jokes, especially at a Trump rally. And so that's always the danger at these rallies, both for Democrats and for Republicans. When you invite on people who have very established names, they have an ability to kind of go off the rails because they already have their core group of supporters. They're not running for anything. So there does run the risk for them to actually do things that are not aligned with the party and do the kind of fine dance that conservatives have to do leading up to Election Day. But more than that, I think it's very important that we recognize, I think, the amount of work that so many conservatives are doing today to shed that skin of, again, being xenophobic, racist, etc. You know, Nikki Haley, Tim Scott. I understand there's groups like the American Compass who are trying to look at public policy issues like economic inclusion, immigration reform, family-centered values, things like this that resonate with more and more immigrant communities. A more welcoming approach to immigration is something that more and more conservatives are pushing for within their conservative camps. As well, I understand there's even groups like Gen Z GOP that's looking at climate change and inclusivity and bridging the gaps between generations. And so there's a lot of work that many members within the conservative tent are doing to kind of redefine what it means to be conservative in 2024. And recognizing that Tony Hinchcliffe is a comedian and he's going to say things that are, with comedic timing and speak to his comedic base or to his comedic training, there's something to be said about doing so at a time where it's appropriate. And I just don't believe that a Trump rally at Madison Square Garden was the appropriate time and place to make those types of jokes and humor when, again, there's so much groundswell and groundwork that conservatives are doing to shed that skin. I would also say the caricature of Donald Trump as anti-immigrant, etc., is something that I think even Trump recognizes he has to do a better job reminding people of the work that he does in immigrant communities or with immigrant communities, etc. And I'm not saying that, Trump hasn't said things in the past or done things in the past that would be perceived as, of course, xenophobic or racist, etc. But there's also a lot of things that the Trump administration did, reaching out to very specific communities in particular, specifically on economic opportunity. And I feel like, again, Hinchcliffe's jokes, and he's reiterated these are jokes, were just not at the right time, especially at a time where, again, conservatives are trying to shed that skin. And in many ways, Hinchcliffe reinforces The things that Hillary Clinton alluded to on Thursday in her interview with CNN. The idea of this being a Nazi rally, this idea of, pursuing the idea of xenophobia, racism, exclusivity against inclusivity. Tony Hinchcliffe feeds that narrative. And so the final thing I'd like to say is, I think in many ways, conservatives can be their own worst enemy sometimes, similar to Democrats. There is something to be said when you feel so confident in your candidate and in your party, and also in the perspectives and the views of your party. And when you're that confident and you're that kind of like, you kick up your heels just a little bit, that's where I think a lot of mistakes, big mistakes, can be made, because you also want to always recognize and honor your opponent. And in doing so, I think Tony Hinchcliffe may have done quite a bit of damage, specifically for moderate conservatives who don't want to be associated with this idea and notion that they're anti-immigrant, that they treat and look at Latinos in a very derogatory way. There are many Latino conservatives that probably feel very strongly about what Tony Hinchcliffe said as well. And I think that that's something the conservatives have to wrestle with and weed out of the party, to be completely honest, even if it's in jest. Because it's just not, I think, healthy for their rebranding and their ideas of kind of moving forward in a more moderate tone. But let me know what you think. Do you think Hinchcliffe's jokes were taken out of context? Do you think that they resonate with more Trump supporters? Or do you think, again, time and place, maybe do that on Kill Tony and not necessarily at a Trump rally? Let me know what you think in the comments below. And folks, as always, please like, subscribe, and share. I'm really trying to get the name and the voice out there for Open Minds. We need more moderate voices in our politics today. Thanks again, and I will catch you in the next one.